Welcome back. I hope you had a good lunch, and I hope people who were joining us online had a good break as well. Since the last 2 days, in fact, since the pre-forum session started, we've been discussing the role of business and the governments in promoting the implementation of the UNGPs. While the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights contain explicit pillars for states and businesses, the role of civil society is addressed more implicitly. Nonetheless, the underlying rationale for the UNGP's framework acknowledges the importance of the roles that the civil society actors can play in promoting business respect for human rights. In fact, one of the critiques of the business and human rights discourse has been this what's known as the dependence on the mainly the top-down approaches, and therefore the lack of bottom-up approaches. The panelists yesterday, and I think many of the participants today, particularly from the indigenous communities, civil society organizations, also discussed the role of various actors, but also the need of bringing in these innovative approaches and strategies to bring together a change and changing the realities that's happening on the ground. In recent years, we've also seen a variety of bottom-up approaches that help change the narrative, served as a wake-up call for many, and raised important questions. The power of media, and the most importantly, social media, has never been more than now. While many of these approaches have been utilized for other social and development issues, I think the human rights, and particularly the business and human rights discourse, hasn't really used these innovative approaches in the way that the other social and development issues or the movements have been able to use. Panelists today will reflect on some of the untapped potential for these actors and the roots of and the tools that they have at their disposal, and stimulate participants to consider innovative ways of initiating broader societal engagement and moving the needle on business and human rights in South Asia. I'm Harpreet Kaur, the Business and Human Rights Specialist at the UNDP Asia Pacific, the moderator of this session. And I have 4 speakers joining with me here today, and we are really delighted to see the 3 speakers joining us online. And without further ado, I would like to welcome the panelists for today's session. We have with us, and the people who are joining us online, if you could just wave your hand so that everybody know who you are, because people who are sitting here in the room cannot really read your name. So it'll be really useful if you can wave your hand when I say your name. Annie Khan, the South Asia Researcher and Representative, Business and Human Rights Resource Center. Thanks, Annie, for joining us today. Aisha Banblat, founder and CEO, Remake. I hope I pronounced your second name correctly. Hemanta Vitange, Executive Director, Center for Environment Justice. Huma Khan, she's the Senior Human Rights Advisor at the Office of the UN Resident Coordinator here in Bangladesh. We have with us Dheeraj, who's the convener at Partners in Change. And we have, last but not the least, Stefania Perna, who's the project manager at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. Thank you for joining us today. I think it's a really good time, perhaps, in the last, in terms of the agenda of the forum as well, because we've been sort of really discussing different approaches on how businesses could come together. There's been a lot of conversations how business, but also how the civil society networks need to work more. And I think that really helps, this session particularly really helps us connect the dots, not just between the different actors and the discourse, but really also helping us bring together the discussions that we've been having since the pre-forum session that started on the 23rd of March. Huma, I'll actually start with you, just to also help us build a little bit of context. I think we've been talking about some of the challenges here since the last few days. What do you think are the key challenges for rights holders in sort of the business and human rights discourse, particularly in Bangladesh? But if you could also sort of bring in some examples from other South Asian countries, that'd be helpful. Thanks, Huma.
Thank you. Considering I have to sum it up in a few minutes' time, I'll try to focus on some of the key issues. I think one of the major problem with business and human rights discourse for rights holders is often people are not even aware of the rights in the context that we are. If we are in Bangladesh, not many would know what their rights are. And necessarily the legal framework does not correspond to the international guiding principles in all countries in South Asia, which is another gap. So accessing, first gap obviously is knowledge and awareness. And then we look at the legal framework if it's really in line with the guiding principles. And even if so, the informal economy is so big that remains an area where it's very, very difficult to mobilize people on these principles. We also see, at least in this context, and I can say for a few other countries, that even if businesses are sensitive, it comes from a more charity-oriented sense. So rather than rights perspective, it's hard to still convince large number of businesses in terms of the rights of the rights holders in business and human rights context. If they are active, often the perspective remains to be more, for example, more charity or helping the poor kind of notion. And we see the governments also operating from that framework in most cases. So that remains another challenge. We also look at, in terms of the international human rights law, obviously these are guiding principles and not binding, which makes it a challenge in terms of how to implement them. We are also not necessarily working, because the UN human rights mechanism works. There is a system when it comes to member states. So because the accountability is mostly for the states, the compliance. Now we are dealing with another entity, which in the context of South Asia, we will also find that often is more powerful than the state itself. And in that context, how do we mobilize rights holders to stand up for their rights, or to take legal discourse or any other, protests and other possible options that are available, or working with businesses? The power gap between the businesses and the rights holders is quite huge. So it's not easy for them to come to a negotiation table, because it's difficult. The power gap is so much more. And then it is linked with the inequalities and poverty in South Asia in general. So if I speak from the workers' point of view, or from some other communities, for example, where in Bangladesh context, where businesses, people have protested against businesses, it's not easy for them, because they are dealing with a power that is much bigger sometimes than the government, and also their options are limited. They don't have social security. So going for a strike, which is the conventional method, which is often used in Bangladesh, but how long are you going to be able to sustain them? That's a question, because there's no social security, and often people then fall back and accept, and businesses know that well in this context of South Asia, that people will not be able to hold for a long time. So these are some of the challenges that I can think. The nexus between the politics, economy, and the businesses, that is quite strong in South Asia. So big businesses often sponsor political parties, and political parties have to pay back by keeping their interests when they come to power. So how do we work with this kind of context where the gap in general is huge, and then we have other actors at play? So I just would like to, perhaps my time is, I hope I'm not over time. So I would like to finish here, and would be very interested to listen to others in terms of options and strategies that have been adopted. Thank you.
Thanks, Suma. When you were saying all of this, I was like, gosh, I should have invited you for the closing plenary, because you've really summed up what we have been discussing, since the last few days. A lack of awareness, I think that's something that came up in across various sessions, but the philanthropic approaches and the distinction between the voluntary versus mandatory. In fact, we had sessions on mandatory human rights due diligence yesterday. And a lot of conversation was really about, with these philanthropic approaches, with these voluntary guidelines, all of this remains, it's good to do. But, are people sort of really the businesses taking a rights-based approach? I think one of the other key issues that you highlighted is also the power dynamics, right? Because, you could go on a strike, but somebody has to feed your family. So who's going to do that, right? In terms of, and I think, again, bringing in also the structural challenges, including sort of poverty, inequality, the discrimination that's there because of this. And I think this really big power gap, or sort of the power dynamics that you brought about. So thank you for bringing, and really helping us set the stage for all the other panelists today, who I'm hoping to hear very interesting approaches that they have been using. I've been following some of their work very closely. Annie, I'm going to turn to you, because the Resource Center has been taking and actually really been bringing in many different innovative approaches in engaging rights holders, and really bringing and creating platforms for the rights holders and the human rights defenders to raise and amplify the voices and their concerns as well. What do you think? I mean, what drives resource center? Where do you see the value of these bottom-up approaches for rights holders? And how do you think, we could particularly complement the top-down approaches with the bottom-up as well? Annie, the floor is yours.
Hi, Harpreet. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for the invitation to join this session. It's truly a pleasure. And as you said, I think the previous sessions focused more on kind of the state and businesses' role. But I think a very key, perhaps missing ingredient is the role of civil society. And I think we as an organization try to amplify that and prioritize that as much as possible in our work. So I'll get to the examples a bit later, but maybe just to set the stage a bit more. So I just want to start by saying civil society is really an essential actor in sustainable development and BHR discourse in general. While governments and international bodies, of course, hold a lot of power, I think in some ways, in some contexts, they're actually less influential than the local civil society and grassroots organizations themselves, as they're the ones that are actually on ground experiencing, the challenges of company activity. For example, large-scale development projects. So as I mentioned, at our organizations, one of our main pillars is amplifying the voices of the communities, which we truly believe change cannot exist without. So a bottom-up approach, as Huma also mentioned, would it really improve rights holders' engagement? I think that's kind of the key top-line message that I would give. I believe only individuals and communities meant to be the beneficiaries of these measures are aware of what their needs are and how they can be met. It's these civil society groups, activists, human rights defenders who can ensure that the resources and accessibility to justice mechanisms, for example, reach who they are intended to reach and achieve what they're intended to achieve. And so as we're seeing in several contexts in the region and also around the world, situations where there's an environment of fear or there are repressive laws, when people's rights to associate or the rights to claim these rights are restricted, we simply cannot ensure that company action will meet the needs of poor or marginalized communities. It's just not possible. So coming back to the question about value, in the BHR discourse, we talk a lot about impact assessments, for example. I think this is a good way to explain why bottom-up approaches are valuable and probably a concept that many of you here are familiar with when it comes to impact assessments. So while impact assessments exist, they're commonly carried out by governments and companies alike. Community-based human rights impact assessments with a bottom-up approach is equally, if not more valuable. And we've really seen that in several cases. And I'll get to those examples of those later on. But community-based human rights assessments are a tool for the empowerment of affected communities. It can be used to amplify voices, reach accountability for violations of human rights that they're experiencing. And through these kind of assessments, we would have better documentation of how the communities are impacted by corporations. It also allows communities to engage with the public and private actors more equally and effectively. So I think this is a key tool and kind of example of how the bottom-up approach can be valued. I think bottom-up approaches are also important simply to allow companies to know and understand the reality on the ground and adapt their responses in order to be more relevant to the context. Companies must assess their human rights policies to explore the actual reach and adjust their policies as necessary. I believe a bottom-up approach is critical to help also build trust and facilitate that kind of trust relationship between companies, workers, and local communities. It's also important to gain what we could call moral legitimacy among various stakeholders, especially now in an era of, let's say, increased ethical investment, in an effort to increase ESG investment and things like that. So on the question of how can we complement top-down and bottom-up approaches, I believe that both have to kind of act in synergy. Obviously, that's easier said than done. But maybe one way is finding cohesions or commonalities in principles and ideas that could facilitate the engagement of beneficiaries without dismissing local relevance or application. So when international human rights norms can seem to confront local communities, sometimes just even properly referring to national constitutions or legislations where available can show the interconnections between human rights instruments and legislation that has direct reference to the community's lives. As Huma also mentioned, I think that capacity and awareness building of existing laws and procedures is really missing, and that's something that can be really beneficial. Similarly, grievance mechanisms, maybe a concept that's perceived as top-down, can actually be really shifted to be looked at as a bottom-up tool, which can complement top-down forms of accountability. In order for grievance mechanisms to be effective, they need to be accessible, they need to be in local languages, stakeholders need to know they exist, they need to know where to find them, they need to be fair, they need to be optionally confidential, for example, and they have to be based on human rights norms. So I think there are opportunities in both bottom-up and top-down processes, but they have to, again, kind of complement each other. And I'll just end maybe with an example of when we think of stakeholder engagement for a new project that a company is involved in. It's important for the stakeholder engagement process to begin, right in the field, and that information to be relayed back to the company so that the company can identify and assess potential human rights risks. The goal of this kind of feedback loop would then encourage the company to make necessary changes before they start the project. So similarly, a top-down conversation would allow a company to nurture trust with the different stakeholders involved and the different ecosystems involved as well. So maybe I'll stop there and again, come back to the examples later on.
Great. Thanks, Sani. I think lots of important points, but, because I've been sort of also following the session since morning, I think stakeholder engagement is kept, something that kept coming in various sessions over the 2 days. But more importantly, today, Huma, we also had a session that focused on informal workers. And I think it was also a lot of conversation about what do they really want, right? I mean, we're all here deciding what they want, or, what communities want, but the value of stakeholder engagement. And I think one of the key issues that was raised this morning was also about the evidence and documentation. And Annie, what you're saying is, if we really bring in these approaches, there's also we would be able to build the documentation, but also the evidence as well. I would like to hear a little bit more on terms of, what you said, the grievance mechanisms can also use bottom-up approaches, but perhaps, when you come back, I'll pass it on to the next speaker. But maybe your second question, we could also look at, if you could share some of the examples with the grievance mechanisms where we have seen the bottom-up approaches, because I think that's, again, one of the topics that's been discussed here a lot in the forum as well. Aisha, I'm going to move on to you. All of us have seen the impact of the pandemic. We've seen the impact of, the impact of pandemic, particularly on the garment workers, migrant workers. But, we're sitting here in Bangladesh, and we know that how garment workers were impacted. And they're still actually suffering and paying for the impact, that happened, the impact from the COVID-19 pandemic. You really did bring a positive change in their lives by creating a simple hashtag pay up. I mean, I'm saying it a simple hashtag because it says on your website, but I know it's not a simple task, and it's not as simple as you've made it sound. So why don't you tell us more about Remake and how you have used some of these innovative approaches to hold corporates accountable? I think it also, I would really love to hear how it all started and what's been your journey. And if you could also share some of the impact that we have had because of this. Aisha, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so very much for having me today. It's so wonderful to be back in the UN family. Prior to founding Remake, I used to work with the UN system, and so it feels like a homecoming of sorts. And so, as you mentioned, the pandemic really caused devastation for garment makers very early in the pandemic. Us at Remake recognized that orders were being canceled. We were hearing from manufacturers as well as union leaders what this meant in terms of devastation in Bangladesh, in India, in Pakistan, which is my home country, and beyond. And so, sort of 1 second on Remake, we are an advocacy organization. I have myself in my career spent a long time working on the inside of the fashion industry, on the policy side within the UN Better Work program. And one of the reasons I founded Remake, sitting here in the global north, was really to create more a groundswell of everyday concerned citizens who are often the end customers of the clothing that garment makers make, to cause radical disruption and to push for people sitting here in the United States, in Europe, in Canada, to be locking arms in solidarity with union leaders, with women-led movements in order to fight for better reform. And so, within Remake, what we do is a lot of education on college campuses. We do a lot of campaigning and advocacy work, and then behind the scenes, a lot of policy reform. To your point of, what happened during the pandemic and all of the mechanics when it came to the Pay Up campaign, it really was a privilege of my lifetime, having fought for garment workers for some 20 years, for Pay Up to have become a viral campaign. But I think some of the key ingredients there were, first and foremost, really a lot of solidarity with union leaders in the global South, manufacturers, because they were also grappling with a pandemic and order cancellations, and then those of us in the West who could really amplify these messages through the use of new and traditional media. So we were meeting, on a weekly basis, talking to different industry groups, BGMEA, GMAC, other groups, to get the research and understand who was canceling orders, of what volume, and that sort of information sharing was really important. Second, for us as a advocacy organization, much as Annie said, we always center the voices of garment maker communities. So it was really hearing directly from union leaders on what was needed. And frankly, it was whether brands take out credit, whether they change payment terms. It was about getting money in the hands of workers for orders that had already been completed and processed as quickly as possible. So, the solidarity piece, us meeting on a weekly basis during the pandemic, was really important. The research for us to be able to understand the order cancellations and for manufacturers in this one particular moment to come together with workers was key. And then really the power of social media. It was the early days of the pandemic. We were unable to protest outside. We were really able to cause a lot of reputational damage for brands that were trying to move product online through Instagram, through Twitter. And, the hashtags were important. The media awareness was important. But at the end of the day, it really was us being in solidarity with union leaders. And so I'd say one of the things we've learned from the campaign is how important it is for us, given our respective positions and where we can make a difference, to see more collaboration within civil society. Often we're operating from a place of scarcity, so we don't do this as well. Information sharing, really sharing resources when it comes to campaigning, and really using the power of new and old media when it comes to engaging with business. Because outside of regulatory reform and having binding agreements, frankly, the only other tool that we have is the reputational damage that we can cause with media engagement and shopper engagement. So those were just some of the secret ingredients that I think made Pay Up as successful as it was. And I'm looking forward to any other questions that may come up. Thank you.
Thanks. Aisha, if I could ask a follow-up question, and this is also a reminder for everybody here online. If you have any questions for the panelists, please, you could type it in the Q&A. And we will also, of course, take questions from the floor. Aisha, actually, if I could just maybe, if you could take 2 minutes to sort of reflect on this, also the role of social media and the role and the engagement with the youth here. So, we have been sort of trying to look at the role of youth, and particularly in terms of, we're looking at the role of youth in responsible consumption, but the way that the youth have started engaging in the climate change conversations, it's about really holding corporates accountable. But I think, we see a lot more young people coming and, kind of raising voice and coming in solidarity for larger human rights issues, for social and development issues. So what has been your experience been, particularly with the Pay Up, but also, just beyond Pay Up with Remake? Do you think it's very youth driven, or do you think this is something that's cutting across different ages, different groups, or any other reflections that you have on the role of youth engagement in here? Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I'll say is, so within Remake, we have an ambassador program. Pre-pandemic, we were organizing in communities by local zip code to really organize and bring youth into the movement. And that on the ground engagement, much as we see with union formation, was really important. And so I'd say, the approach of using social media for us has always been that it's a tool, but you can't just have all of your activism happen online. It's really important to have the infrastructure and the organizing, as we've seen with the climate movement, as we do with the human rights work, to have the infrastructure. We have ambassadors and community organizers in cities across the US, now in Canada, now across South Asia, who are really our foot soldiers in engaging youth and mobilizing them. So that, I'd say, is one, that it's really important to have that type of infrastructure. I'd say the second is that when it comes to online engagement, it can be a mixed bag. There can sometimes be a lot of slackivism. We've had to teach youth that it's not just about, clicking something and liking something, but really being in solidarity with garment makers. I think one of the things that business has really perpetuated, which is a falsity, is that somehow responsible consumption is the way for us to get to human rights and addressing the climate crisis. And we are really here to re-educate youth on the importance of engaging in regulatory reform, in fighting for worker rights, because it's not their individual decisions of whether they, buy less or somehow get an electric car or eat healthy that's going to address a lot of these issues of human rights and the climate crisis. So, we really work with youth to move them away from individual consumption decisions to coming together as a collective. That said, TikTok and Instagram for us is our bread and butter. It's a way for us to take really dense, complicated human rights issues and mobilize youth. One of the things we've learned is to make the campaign demands very simple, to mobilize them in a way where, it's okay, today we're doing this, tomorrow we're doing that. So to an extent, hand holding, but certainly it is a way to get a lot of business attention, because our community, and even though our community is very youth powered, the other sort of big demographic that cuts across all age groups is that we're very women centric. That's just happened. Globally, it is women, whether millennial or Gen X or Gen Z, but it is often the customers of the fashion industry, which is why I think they paid so much attention to our campaigns.
Thanks, Aisha, and thanks also for bringing the context of also this attention span, which seems to be getting lesser and lesser each day, but also the importance of bringing the human rights. How do we really break down human rights and simplify it for the people, so that we could also connect not just with the people, the same people that we meet across at all the conferences. We see the same faces, but really take these discussions, take these issues out with the general public, also so that they understand it doesn't remain in this silo of human rights movements or, the people here. In fact, your response really helps me to sort of build on the next question that I have from Stefania, because you did say that social media is only a tool, but the magic does not happen just online, right? We also need foot soldiers. And one of the key roles, I think, that has been played by, played by journalists in bringing attention to these issues has been phenomenal. I think particularly also during the pandemic, we've seen the way, despite, they were at the risk themselves, right? But they were out there covering stories for us and really bringing that information, because obviously nobody was really able to go out, but these were the journalists who were also part of the foot soldiers out there day in, day out, and many of them got impacted themselves. Stefania, you have been working a lot with many of these journalists. In fact, we've done some work together as well. And I think I really do want you to sort of bring together also attention on this initiative where you have to strengthen the anti-trafficking ecosystem. So perhaps if you could share with us how the Thomson Reuters Foundation address modern slavery and trafficking, who are the stakeholders that you're engaging with? And I think I would really also like you to bring references to the not just journalists, but how you're also helping them connect with other civil society organizations and businesses, and helping sort of establish those networks to bring these issues out in the fore. So Stefania, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Harpreet. And let me echo what other speakers have just said. It's my absolute pleasure to be here today and really to have this opportunity to share more about our work, because I can see really a lot of alignment and a lot of a path towards the same direction. So to answer your question, to give a little bit of overview of the work of the Thomson Reuters Foundation. So it has been roughly 10 years since the foundation has really started contributing to the fight against modern slavery, human trafficking. And our attempt has always been exactly to do what these panels is about. It's about connecting the dots. So we have been engaging with a variety of stakeholders, journalists, newsrooms and media organizations, civil society and social enterprises, and also business and business organization. Because we really leverage on our unique blend of expertise in three main areas, which I'm going to tell you about in these few minutes to give this overview. So on the one side, journalism and media development, pro bono legal research and support, but also the power of convenings to foster economies that are equitable, participatory, and sustainable. So as you can already see from this brief introduction, it's really picking on some of the areas that have been already raised and flagged during these presentations. So let me start though by our media work. So we all know that slavery is a very difficult crime to cover and requires a range of investigative reporting skills, a deep understanding of defamation and privacy laws, and the risk the victims incur if exposed. So to contribute to a more accurate and also safer reporting on the issue, we basically train journalists around the world. And to date, we've trained journalists on this issue in around 20 countries. But how do we do that? Of course, through journalism training. This is so education, what we were talking about before. And our journalism training really focuses, let's say, on three main areas. One is content, so looking at fundamental facts and definition, how to work with survivors and people in situation of exploitation, but also the economics of modern slavery, so how to relate to businesses. At the same time, we do this by applying techniques that are innovative, such as solution journalism and data visualization, really to leverage on the interest and on the attention of readers. But that's not the end of the story. We also add training, like mentoring to our trainings, and also networking session with civil society. And here is where, like, the first example of connecting the dots. So in our training, we really try to connect journalists and civil society actors to facilitate communication, but also to ensure the best practices and know-how are shared to facilitate reporting on one side and scaling impact on the other side. In fact, what we have been implementing is what we call in internal jargon dual track training. So addressing journalists and other actors to foster cross-sector links. Because on the one side, we train journalists to bolster their coverage, as well as meeting NGOs, who are, in most of the cases, the sources of their stories. But on the other hand, we really want NGOs to sharpen their communication and connect more meaningfully with journalists, so that they are able to pitch their stories and really their ideas and work. So as you mentioned before, we are in the middle of an anti-slavery, anti-trafficking project in India, Malaysia, Thailand, and Colombia. Happy to share more information. Actually, I will give more information in just a moment. But just wanted to say with regards to journalism training that we're going to implement this journalism training in those 4 countries this year. So more information can be found on our website. And again, happy to answer any question. But moving to the other area of our work, so how we engage with businesses and civil society as a bridge, really connecting the dots. As I was mentioning, the foundation has engaged in a 3-year anti-slavery, anti-trafficking project in India, Thailand, Malaysia, and Colombia. And we really engage with private sector, civil society, and the media to facilitate collaboration, and through this collaboration to strengthen the responses to modern slavery, human trafficking in the supply chain, but also beyond it. And how we do it? By engaging in outreach via intents and convenings with private sector and civil society, and really try to be a bridge between them. to facilitate discussion around, for example, responsible business practices, but also by drawing the stakeholder attention on the tools, the initiative, the processes, the so-called services that are currently available in each country to strengthen human rights due diligence mechanism. As for the journalism training, we're going to deliver these convenings in the 4 countries, so India, Malaysia, Thailand, and Colombia this year. So again, happy to answer any question in this sense. In these convenings, we leverage on ESG mechanisms. So this is an area that we cover, especially the social aspect of the ESG mechanism, because the foundation has been bringing together a partnership of civil society, expert, private sector, really to emphasize the importance of the social aspect of ESG mechanism. And the result has been a white paper. Again, happy to share the link to the white paper later. But also let me flag that when it comes to anti-slavery, since 2015, we've run the Stop Slavery Award, which is a ceremony and a process that really looks and recognizes and celebrates those who fight against modern slavery and all forms of human trafficking. This year, for the first time, we will have the ceremony in person, 28th of April, first time in 2 years. We are super excited. And let me close this by leveraging, again, touching on one area of work which really looks specifically at civil society organization. Because legal aspect and legal framework is one point that was raised before. Again, I don't know how many are familiar with the Trust Law Network, but the Trust Law Network is Thomson Reuters Foundation Global Pro Bono Legal Service, and it addresses civil society and social enterprises all over the world. And what we do through the Trust Law is connecting high impact NGOs and social enterprises who work to create social and environmental change with the best law firms and corporate legal teams, and really to provide them with free legal assistance, but also to coordinate legal research that can help them improving their understanding on the legal national legal ecosystem, but also to identifying best practices and potential areas of reform. We are in the process in India, Malaysia, Thailand, and Colombia of developing this research, which will be presented next year. So a lot of information to wrap up 3 main areas of work: civil society, private sector, the media, organization working in the civil society, working on communication, and convenings with private sector. So happy to answer any question and also to share more information later. Back to you, Harpreet.
Thanks, Tiffany. In fact, UNDP last year, I think that's when we sort of started connected, also the UNDP really worked, and we developed what's known as the Handbook for Journalists to Report on Business and Human Rights. And somebody from the team perhaps can share the link here. But this is also, one of our learnings had been while developing that handbook has been, some of the key issues actually that you are highlighting here is, to kind of engage with different stakeholders and bringing, those voices also, not just sort of kind of looking at it from one perspective as well. Also, perhaps if you could share the links here in the chat so that people can have access to, or if you could share it with us later, we can perhaps send it around among the participants as well. So we started with grassroots movements, taking it on to the social media and the role of traditional media. I'm now going to turn to you, Hemanta. You have an app for justice. This is, your Center for Environment Justice has formulated apps. And one of the key apps I think that we've been working with is this e-justice app, where citizens can anonymously report environmental crimes about forests and wetlands. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about, particularly because you're using app, right? But there are also issues about the accessibility to mobile phone, but also the data, right? It's not just about, whether you have, there is an app available, but also the data, access to these smartphones, because that's where you would generally use these apps. What has been your experience, some of the challenges that you're facing, but how do you think the communities have really benefited from this app? If you could share your experience. Thanks.
Thank you very much for this invitation. In fact, I have worked 32 years bringing a lot of environmental cases to the national courts and to the accountability mechanisms, the Asian Development Bank, World Bank, etc. In all our countries, we have more than 100 laws, environmental laws to protect the environment, protect the human rights and bring fundamental rights applications to the courts. But the issue is that so we are using all these traditional systems. Either we complain to the police, or either we complain to the various governmental institutions, to the central environmental bodies, or otherwise we bring cases to the national courts. Earlier, so we used to get all these information, the cases through in writing as the letters, petitions sometime. But it takes some time because it is the traditional systems, and sometime it comes maybe after few weeks later. And then we started with the technology. We started using the hotlines. So we have a dedicated hotline in my organization. I think we have the similar systems in various other organizations. The kind of work we do in Sri Lanka, we have the same type of activities done in Bangladesh by Bangladesh Environmental Lawyers Association. In India, we have few organizations like Life. In Nepal, we have ProPublic. We all are doing the same kind of approach. But then we thought that when an incident happen, immediately if they can have a system to make complaint, so that will be much easier. So that's the foundation for producing a mobile app. And we found that more than the people in my country, in Sri Lanka, there are smartphones. But one of the problem we found that in most of the areas, they have 3G, and in certain areas, there's no signal at all. That's one of the challenge for us. So then we made this mobile application that when you open the application, you will open the camera, and then you can take the pictures of whether it's a forest destruction or pollution, the dumping waste or something like that. You take few pictures, then you enter that, and then you will get the space for putting some text. What is happening? Where is this location? Automatically, when you take the picture, you get the location itself. Then you submit. So then it comes to the system, and once we needed to verify this one, because sometimes people can take pictures from somewhere else and put that as a picture from the location. So then we will get the wrong data. So then initially we wanted to have the verification. Then we had our some members connected to our organization, so they do the verification before we click this information goes to the map, which you can see all these issues. Earlier we used the same system with the web application, but when it comes to the smart app, so it was much better. But then we found, you were asking about challenges, and when we found that in certain areas in Sri Lanka, you have the 3G, and the app we have produced actually is 4G application. So we had issues with how do you upload these photos in a 3G area, and also in certain areas you don't have the signals. I think maybe that's the general technical challenge we have. So at the moment we are updating this one to go offline photos, and also we are working with in a better app together with various government agencies, because the new app we are trying to propose is not only going to be a civil society app. So once people put this information into the app, it will appear for the wildlife department, forest department, various government forces, police, and everybody who has some sort of access. They will have the information, and they will see where this incident is happening, so they can immediately react to that one. So that's the idea, and at the moment we are on halfway of this more national level app with the support of all the government agencies and non-government agencies, and so we also have the UN bodies supporting us. I think it's going to be a much developed mobile app for Sri Lanka. And we are putting so many different layers like the forest, lakes and everything. So then immediately you can see where actual location is and what kind of impact that can create. Immediately whether it's within the boundaries of the forest department reserve forest area, or whether it's the wildlife department under the comes under the jurisdiction of the wildlife department. So that's the sort of app so we are building. So I think we are going one step further from the current mobile app. I believe that will be helpful for getting quick information to react. The issue with environmental issues, if you delay your actions, you will not recover them at all. Immediately when you see the first few trees are cutting down, that's the moment you have to take action. If you wait 1 week to take action, probably you will lose about 10-50 hectares sometime. That's the size of the damage. With the bulldozers, with the chainsaws, kind of new equipments we have developed in this world, the damage is so fast. And we have a case, we won the case because this is a destruction of a wildlife national park in Sri Lanka. They have destroyed about 800 hectares with the support of government politicians. Then we won the case, and the court said the forest department, which didn't take action against the destruction of the forest, need to replant all these. 825 hectares of forest need to replant by the forest department. The politician who was involved in this decision making, he was the leader in this one, and he has to pay the money under the polluter pays principle. He has to pay 1,075 million Sri Lankan rupees for the replantation he has to pay to the forest department. But now we found there's no areas to plant. And now we have to find 400 hectares about another 300 kilometers away, and another 200 kilometers away, another 200 hectares. So that forest or the wildlife area lost this forever. And the elephants living in the wildlife area doesn't get benefits by planting trees 400 kilometers away. So that's how urgent that we have to immediately stop this kind of issue. So that is why this kind of apps going to be very helpful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Hemanta. In fact, this reminds me of the conversation that I was having with one of my colleagues who, in fact, perhaps would have joined today as well, is the power of this phones on, the camera on the smartphone. And we were particularly talking in the context of Ukraine. I don't know, Livia, if you're here, but, remember we were talking about, and how you mentioned how somebody could just take a picture of what's happening on the ground and upload it on social media. And there's an evidence, and, you already have a documentation. So I think in some ways the documentation has become easy, but of course, there is misinformation, there is disinformation, and, that could be used both ways. So it's really important to also verify the facts as well. Hemanta, if I could actually just ask a follow-up question, and thanks, Dheeraj, for being very patient with us. I will come to you in a second. But, on your app, are we also looking at, is there a way on this app that people can see, or, people who are filing complaints can see whether, when they've submitted this complaint, is there a time for that which the government or the duty bearers have to respond, or is there any follow-up mechanism through the app, or is there a timeline? Because again you started your remarks with the timeliness of and why we need to be really we really need to be conscious of the time that somebody may lose in that context. So is there a way that people can track back, and is there a time that they have to refund?
Yeah, very good question. I think the current app we are using, so somebody has to manage this one, and once we get the information, then we have a staff in my organization. They communicate with the forest department, wildlife department, and when it's been resolved, so then you change the situation in the app as well. But the one we are producing at the moment, we are trying to manage that one, because that involves about 10 different departments, and immediately such information will be available, and they all want to take the action. So that's the discussion we are doing right now. So I think we will have those improvements coming in the new web. But this verification is a very, very important, because I'll share one other information. And one time we got information about that forest destruction is happening, and then we didn't have anybody to verify, and we ourselves went to that area because it was about huge deforestation, and we found actually it's a misinformation. Perhaps the somebody who wants to use this app to give the misinformation. Actually, the destruction was happening in some other area. So that is why this verification is very important, because then somebody can fool you. Definitely, I think it's happening even on the Zoom calls now. So definitely verification is very important, because otherwise, when you are making this kind of criminal sort of complaint about somebody who is doing this thing, and it is important. And also at the same time, so we want to make sure that the person who is providing this information, the safety of the person who is giving this information, because otherwise, if it is going to be available to the enemy or the other side, or the destroyer, so definitely he can use that information to find the person, and we will be putting them into the risk. So because here right now in the world, we are talking about environmental human rights defenders, and they are the much under threat. So we have to be very careful about the person who is giving this information.
Sure. Thanks. Dheeraj, I think, almost I think everybody among the panelists would sort of talk about the importance of stakeholder consultation and bringing in those voices to the forefront. Now, PIC, I know that has done remarkable job, particularly, sort of bringing in the voices of the marginalized communities, particularly in the context of the National Action Plan, the development of the National Action Plan in India. I mean, of course, I've seen you've been doing a lot of other work, and bringing in these voices as well. In fact, I remember, even at the India session, you did help us sort of bring together the voices of the workers, during the discussions as well, and really bringing those people and the affected communities to these tables, I think is really, really important. Could you share with us, some of the approaches and strategies you have used in building up these approaches? And I think it's not an easy task. Last year at the Responsible Business and Human Rights Forum, we tried to bring in sort of 11 languages, 11 Asian languages for our RBHR forum. And of course, it was really, really good. We were able to bring together people from different communities, and they could listen to different languages, they could have conversations and ask questions, but it wasn't an easy task for us, and we kind of really felt that as a big challenge. And I'm saying this from our own experience, and now I know that given India is the diversity in India and the languages that we have, how do you bring these voices, and any learnings, any lessons that you could share with us? Thanks, Dheeraj.
Thanks, Harpreet. I think in India we have a very unique kind of situation where on one hand, we are seeing that government and companies are kind of expressing their commitment that, yes, they are ready for National Action Plan, or having business and human rights elements being incorporated in their core working. So, but on the other hand, on civil society side, or I would say when we talk about bottom-up approach, there's a different kind of challenge that we are facing, that how to translate this language and take it to the groups that are actually working on ground. So, for us, we started in 2012-13 with disclosure analysis, and always we moved as a top-down approach, I would say, in our work. And we realized that action plans are not new to any country. Like India had a National Action Plan on climate change, and we know what happened with that. We don't need to repeat that story. So all the groups were very clear that this is going to be another action plan, and nothing will move further on that. So what we have tried doing, we have tried to first recognize that there are certain limitations within BHR framework itself that we need to recognize, that we don't have solution for each and every thing. And there have already been human rights movements that are happening in India. So if there's a environment rights movement happening, if there's a land rights movement happening, if there's a movement happening with focus on indigenous people's rights, then okay, that language should remain as it is, rather than giving it a basket of human rights and business language, I would say. So to that extent, we started engaging with groups. We took this data to ground. We did around 21 consultations, met 250 plus organizations across 11 states. So our idea was that let's go and meet people take this framework and see how do they relate to this framework. Is there something that this framework can offer? Because for a group that is already into a litigation process in court, HRDD may not mean anything. Like they're already into a phase where they need some justice to be done. Or for a group that is losing, getting displaced many times, having due diligence means nothing. For them, it's now at a next stage of action. So many times these frameworks have their own limitations, I would say, that we need to see. Second, what can we offer? Like if it is their struggle, then as a framework, what kind of evidences or narratives we can provide? So we had been interacting with all the groups, trying to find if there are certain violations, then how we can connect UNGPs to those violations rather than saying this is the solution, one-point solution for you. So that's where we tried to shift the narratives, I would say. Still, I would put that condition that in spite of these processes, we are not confident that we were very inclusive in our approach, or we were able to take on board voices of all the affected groups or communities in our processes, but to a limited extent, we tried to put it forth. And in terms of priorities, if we see like what communities wanted, they wanted robust grievance redressal systems for themselves so that they can go and complain and they can find solutions. They wanted protection for human rights defenders and whistleblowers. If someone is coming forward, there should be protection. They wanted diversity in corporate space. For a community living in a project area, they always wondered why they are not in the top management of the companies or not in the top spaces of companies. Always they are in the lower down in the supply chain. They wanted to have right to collectivize because that is also being subverted again and again in these geographies. Then they said if government is also running businesses, like there are public sector enterprises, so why not it is setting example first by that. So having public procurement or looking at investment, or where government is itself playing a role in the project, then why not they are implementing these functions? So these were the kind of demands. We have a very unique challenge because now even within civil society space, I would say human rights defenders, activists, groups that are on ground, they are pointing fingers that you are doing this, but how is it going to help us? And on the other hand, many CSOs are trying to prove business case for human rights, but there should be no business for NGOs to prove that there's a business case. And businesses know how to prove business case. So I don't know why this kind of movement has started happening, and which is, I will say, to great extent also affecting the civil society solidarity on ground.
Thanks, Dheeraj. Again, why do we really need a business case for respecting human rights? I think this is a question that came up yesterday as well. If there was no business case, are we not respecting human rights? This is again also brings me back to some of the conversations that we've been having about gender equality. There is a business case for bringing in more women and equal number of women to the workplace. What if there is no business case? Are we not going to do that? So thank you really for raising that point. We are kind of, sort of have about half an hour, but maybe I can take a few questions from the floor. And I see there are some questions online. Perhaps if we can take maybe questions here now, and then I'll come back to the speakers again. Okay, let's go online this time because we've been giving a lot of preference to people here in the room. There's a question here, and I'll ask, if any of you would like to answer. Also, Aisha, Annie, Stefania. How do you see the capacity building interventions for the youth of the South Asian countries in understanding the human rights and how those rights are impacted by the businesses? The youth are the next level professional, to my opinion. Sorry, I'm going to have to just bring it closer to me. It would be much more effective to train them on business and business human rights and prepare them to be the change agent. Would you consider such interventions as a bottom-up approach? So I think we did sort of also, mention briefly earlier. My question to Aisha was also sort of about, the youth engagement, and can we really sort of start with them? I don't know if anybody, maybe we should read 2 or 3 questions and then just take it together. The second one is largely on sort of regarding violation of land, environment, climate, business, and human rights of the state or corporates, where we will file the complaint. I think it's largely also about, in terms of where do we, I mean, if there are these complaints, where do we file these complaints? And I think there are different grievance mechanisms. Perhaps, Annie, when we come back to you, you can respond on to some of these questions, particularly in the context of grievance mechanism. But also, Aisha, I think this is a question perhaps, also for maybe you and Hemanta together. The victims in Bangladesh are really compensated. Can the ordinary people in Bangladesh seek environmental justice? So I think it's particularly in the context of the workers that even, when there is a lot of noise about garment workers, even they don't get compensated, how do we sort of see if there's any justice that they can get on environmental issues as well? I don't know if anybody wants to go here. Okay, let's see if the speakers want to take, feel free to pick any questions that you may want to respond.
I want to touch the last question. Actually, we have this term about environmental justice, and we are seeking that through the existing systems, through the courts. We are expecting that justice will come. But in the real world, this is not really happening, because in certain cases, when you have 1,000 cases, 1,000 incidents, maybe only 1 or 2 goes to the courts, and it takes a longer time in the court system, sometimes 5 years, 6 years, in some of my cases taken more than 10 years, 12 years. So after that, even if you get the compensation, or even if you get some kind of judgment, it's not actually receiving the real justice. So the immediate thing is, now when you have these kind of guidelines, the UNGP guidelines, so we have to think about prevention at the very beginning. So if once the incident happened, it's very hard to achieve that sort of injustice. So that's the case in Bangladesh, that's the case in Sri Lanka or India, and all these times. And the compensation sometime. So when you say probably the companies, because they deal with money and they're happy to pay sometime compensation, it's not the case, because we know there are many cases in India, yeah, exactly. So those kind of cases, the companies don't have the wealth to pay the amount of compensation that if in case they're going to give, and they will use the best lawyers in the world to argue that why not they should pay this compensation. So you cannot achieve that justice through that sort of a system. So that's why I think the upfront systems need to be there, and prevention is the most important thing. And if we wait for the justice to come through the provided legal systems, I think so we are not going to achieve. That's my experience in the last 3 decades, at least.
Sure. So the companies will pay the lawyers. They're happy to pay the lawyers to really fight about why they shouldn't pay, but they wouldn't pay the affected community. So maybe we need to try and put in more efforts towards prevention. Interesting. Annie, I'm going to come to you if you do want to respond to particularly on this question on the grievance mechanisms. Where could people file complaint? But perhaps if you could use that opportunity to also expand a little bit more beyond, not just the complaint mechanisms, but also any other grievance mechanisms perhaps that community can use. The floor is yours, Annie.
Yeah, hi. So I wish I had a lot more positive examples of this. Unfortunately, we've seen that the grievance mechanisms are not as effective as maybe they're, set out to be. But I can give you one example with one of our partners, Accountability Council. So they are involved in a case in a tea plantation in Assam, which is a state in India. And they've actually been able to use the, I believe it's the IFC grievance mechanism to actually make quite a bit of progress in that case. There was a situation where the workers were receiving less than the wages that they were promised. There were some other issues with their accommodation and livelihoods being affected. So they actually worked with the community IFC through the IFC complaint process. And IFC actually visited the site, did their own evaluation, They sat across the table with the communities. They spoke directly with the community representatives. And now, it's actually progressed quite a bit where the IFC has admitted that there has been harm caused. And they're looking to, hopefully compensate or, change their actions in that case. So that's kind of one example from Assam. So these kind of IFIs, international financial institutions, do have their own grievance mechanisms. We've seen that they have been quite effective, given that they are international, there is a bit more kind of spotlight on their effectiveness. But unfortunately, at the local level, even with the national human rights institutions, though they do have a complaints process, we have not seen very much, success with that. So that's the unfortunate situation. I'm not aware of each South Asian country, but at least for the case in India, that's the case. So I think these IFI grievance mechanisms have proven to be effective. They, at least, if given the opportunity, do speak with the community members. They understand the issues, and then, in some cases they take action. So that's kind of the experience that we've had with grievance mechanisms. And maybe Harpreet, in the last section, I can share a bit more on non-grievance mechanism, but other innovative approaches that we've seen in our work.
Sure, great, thanks. And I would actually also like to remind everyone here, you could also, there are UN complaints mechanisms as well. There are special rapporteurs on certain thematic issues on countries. Perhaps that's also another complaints mechanism that can be used as well, particularly to sort of highlight some of the challenges that the communities are facing on the ground. On the question on the youth, if nobody wants to add, but perhaps I could just say that, we've been listening to Professor Surya Deva. Surya also runs what's known as a Human Rights and Business Academy, and he really does these trainings each year for the young people, with the different universities. Perhaps we can also share more information about it, but for those who are interested in that, definitely check out Human Rights and Business Academy that's been run by Professor Surya Deva. Highly recommended, engaging, particularly in the context of engagement with youth, but also at the UNDP, we've been doing a lot of work in creating awareness and building capacities of young people on business and human rights. So happy to share that information later. Okay, I'm going to move here. If there are any questions from the room here. Can somebody pass on the mic here, please? This gentleman here. Oh, no, sorry. The mic is that side.
Thank you very much. I'm from Nepal. I'm Durga Rai. I'm as an indigenous lawyer. So thank you very much for that, because we have been dealing number of cases linked to business and human rights. Actually, we are dealing with, we have filed a case to the different complaint mechanisms of the bank. Actually, we're working with Asian Development Bank, European Investment Bank, even with the World Bank. But what we have experienced is that those complaint mechanisms are actually not working well, right? So what we have been blamed is that the indigenous peoples are actually against they are the anti-development element, right? So these kind of, challenges we have been actually experiencing, right? So number of hydropower projects, transmission line are in operation in the territories of indigenous peoples. And as you can see, there is huge dispute with the indigenous communities and local people. Therefore, what this forum can do for awareness building, especially with the business community and the states, because they are not actually willing to implement the UN guiding principle. Thank you.
Thank you. There was another question. Maybe let's take a question at the back. And if you could just introduce yourself, be very brief and ask your question, that'll be good. There's a question at the back.
Yes, thank you. My small sharing is that in Bangladesh, we are very active in social media advocacy, especially to cross movement building, like Japanese companies investing in Matarbari. So when we use the Twitter platform and we engage the diplomats and the Japanese young people, so we win a victory and Japanese companies stop their investment in Matarbari. So I'm very happy to hear that you are running a center on the human rights and business. So we think more young people will be joined from South Asia, and we will create more pressure on social media and e-advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you. It's actually good to hear a positive case and a success story. I think there are very few success stories. So thank you for sharing that story. And remember also yesterday, I think it was one of the sessions where we did talk about the pressure points and what is the need for pressure points, particularly in the context of also investors and the companies who are coming here. So thank you for really sharing this story. There was this one hand here and then, this, okay, so we'll just take two more questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Harpreet. I have like few stories just wanted to, like share with you, though not very much best, I would say, but, good practices so far, established in Nepal in regard to grievance handling. And at the same time, like strengthening the synergy coordination among different actors to advance, protect, and promote the human rights. Talking about innovative grievance handling mechanism, UNDP supported National Human Rights Commission to introduce the app. As Hemant already mentioned, though these apps, have been developed to oversee and receive the complaints on human rights generically, but during the pandemic, it worked very well to receive the complaints in regard to the violations of business sectors in the name of medical services to the poor and vulnerable. Government introduced, like free PCR, this all thing. However, the private sectors, in particular medical, like service providers, were involved, like charging very expensively. So it became a serious issue, and the Human Rights Commission took, a very stringent, very, strong action, I would say, against it. And later on, like Supreme Court also brought this issue in a very serious manner, and now directives already, issued upon, and the government has rectified the practices so far. So that is one thing. Besides that, now we have also been supporting to the concerned stakeholders in introducing paralegals. And they are also, fulfilling two purposes. One is to educate the concerned stakeholders, including private sectors, on business human rights and the norms and principles set by different international human rights treaties. That is one thing. Second thing is about again, receiving the complaints and provide legal aid services to the concerned stakeholders. And there are workers, several workers, more than 500-600 workers within 1 year duration of time benefited by the services provided by paralegals. These are mostly youths. And the thirdly, again, about engaging with youth, it's about human rights curricula, focusing on business and human rights, already introduced by different colleges, including government ones. And there are 100 law graduates being, benefited by this course. And hopefully, they would be the instrumental in terms of addressing the issues on business human rights. And lastly, I don't know whether it would be relevant or not, but I think, it's about connecting the dots, not domestically, but also with international, concerned like-minded institutions. It's about, developing the networking between NHRIs, because, business human rights is the issue of non-territorial, falls under non-territorial jurisdiction. So all the NHRIs should, have a good network to work together and challenge the issues on the violations of, human rights by the private sectors. Thank you.
Thanks, Dick, and thank you for highlighting the role of the NHRIs as well. Prakash, we'll take that last question from you, and then I think we're going to run out of time after that. So let's just also try to get back to the speakers.
Actually, this is not my question, but I just wanted to contribute to this discussion, based on my experience working with youth, as well as some of my research on nonviolent civil resistance movement. So I think if we want to build a momentum, particularly in the context of business and human rights, I think it's really important to learn from the ongoing social movements that are happening in the region. And based on that, what I've learned from those movements is that I think the first thing that we need to answer is what kind of bottom-up action we're actually looking for. Is it a movement building that we're trying to do, or is it just a legal action which will have a kind of case by case approach? And is it for policy making, or is it for some sensitizing community, or are we negotiating for something? So I think it's very important to be clear what kind of bottom of action we're looking for. The second one is how to present, a particular issue, like as a public concern issue. Like, for example, when we talk about, let's say, the issue of informal sector workers, we are planning to organize informal sectors like summit at the provincial level. So we could draw the attention of the provincial level stakeholders on the agenda of informal sectors workers. So I think, and also, the leadership is also very, very important. So if the right holders, are leading kind of the process, then that enhance the legitimacy of the movement. So leadership, who is in the leadership, who is in the driving seat, that is also very, very important. And I also would like to emphasize, the creative approaches, can we bring the music, art, kind of stuff, to build that momentum at the local level. So I think these are some of the, ideas that I could share in this forum. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for all of your comments. I think, Prakash, you really nailed it. We may have all the tools in our advocacy box, but if we don't know what do we really want, or if you're not able to communicate clearly what exactly do we want, all the tools are going to be just useless. I think so. It's really important in terms of, really defining what do we want when we're doing, certain advocacy for certain issues as well. So thank you for raising that point. We only have about 15 minutes left. So maybe if I can turn back to my speakers again, and thank you everyone for your comments. I think there were some questions, but perhaps you can try to respond, sort of building into your answers. All of you will have sort of about 2 minutes each. I'm sorry, we're going to have to cut down time maybe to the speakers, but I really wanted to take some questions from the floor. But also when you respond to these questions, perhaps you could also use that as sort of building up your concluding remarks as well. That would be really helpful. Thanks. Huma, I'm actually just going to go back to you, because I think we have heard these different approaches. You helped us lay down the challenges and sort of really the business, the situation on the ground as well in terms of what are the key challenges, but also who are the key actors that are there in the space. I think the examples that we shared today, both from the speakers, but also with the participants here, we heard some of the approaches, some of the actors that they've engaged with. What do you think is the potential of this collective action between various actors? I mean, particularly in the context of Asia, where we now see that the civic space is shrinking, much more than it ever had. So, particularly in the context of shrinking civic space, how do you think these collective actors and actions can bring about a change?
Thank you, Harpreet. We've had a wide range of experience and a rich experience, really rich sharing of experiences. I just wanted to say that when we say civic space is shrinking, yes and no, because we also see the emergence of a different civic space in this process of shrinking of civic spaces. And why I say this, because emergence or re-emergence of some of these methodologies so we had about 2 decades of a lot of NGOs which are funded and structured, but we see more, again, spontaneous movements, young people coming onto the streets or joining the movement or doing something. We see, of course, social media, we've discussed at length how that can be used. So, and then young entrepreneurs sometimes that we did not touch upon, but they are a potential, they can be a potential advocate if they are educated in a manner that we have been discussing. So the space is shrinking, but it's also changing. So we may not find funding and foreign funding and FCRA and the rest of it, but that doesn't mean that people's movements are necessarily shrinking. So I would not look at this in a completely negative manner. However, just with one caveat, I would end, because many of South Asian countries have very stringent legislations about opposing the state, and the connection between the state and big businesses, that is very, very powerful. So how much risk people take in raising those concerns, that's something that remains to be seen. But that's where I would like to end and keep it to probably a bit more than 2 minutes. Thank you.
Sure. And thank you for a slightly optimistic note. And actually, Huma, I really agree with you here when you're saying, the space is changing as well. And we have new actors who are coming in the space. And it's also on to us on how we use that space or the the space, and that's been created now given the current realities as well. So thank you for that. Dheeraj, you mentioned that you've managed to bring together a few communities, a few sections of the society. You have done this. It's kind of a successful experiment, I would say, or a successful pilot. We've seen how so many voices were brought together to particularly this National Action Plan development process. How do you think you can scale up these bottom-up approaches? I think one of the key challenges remain with us that many of these initiatives that we undertake are also, remain limited in a certain particular sector, in a certain community. Where do you see, how can we really scale up these approaches as well? Your 2 minutes.
I think I have only 2 points. One is we feel that disclosure is the key. So we have been pushing for more disclosures from business space, and idea is to take it to communities or to affected groups and see how they can use this data and information. So surely on that front, I do see some movement. And in India, because we have business responsibility and sustainability reporting framework in place now, which is mandated for top 1,000 companies. So idea will be to start working on that data and take it to communities, make them understand that data, and also see how they can use it. Second, I think because we have been talking about human rights movements that are already there in South Asia. So there's scope for, I think, South-South cooperation also to great extent among CSO groups, because to be very frank, still it seems like a global north setting the agenda for global south. So when it comes to human rights and business approach, so somewhere we need to move to South-South cooperation among civil society groups and see how some of these voices can be mainstream. Yeah,
great. Thanks, Dheeraj. And I think, some of the conversations, particularly that we had, for example, at the CSO Safe Spaces on the day one, are generally, the approach, or at least the intention of the organizers of the forum is also to use those spaces with the stakeholder specific consultation, is also to create that network and the South-South exchange groups as well. We do that, as also at the South Asia Forum, but also at the RBHR Forum, which is now kind of more Asia Pacific, where we bring together different, actors and organizations from the global South. But perhaps, there's much more that needs to be done, and there's much more that we can do together as well. Thanks. Stephania, what tools are available for journalists, for civil society organizations, human rights defenders, trade union, and citizens to promote business respect for human rights? And I think I'm also just want to connect this, with Dheeraj's question, because he did talk about disclosures as well. So any tools that you would like to share that could be used for the same? The floor is yours.
I think you're great. Thanks. Just in 2 minutes, I will try to wrap up. Well, there are many tools. We've heard about them already during this session today. We've heard about apps, we've heard about hashtags, we've heard about campaigns, we've heard a lot needs of grievance mechanism. And what we heard is that most of the time, 99% of the time, these tools are led by civil society organizations, are made available by civil society organizations who are in the front line, who are really working with workers and vulnerable communities. What we've heard also that there is a strong need to make these tools relevant for the context in which they operate. A lot of important regional and international tools, but what happens on the ground, in the local context is really important. What we've also noticed today, but also in our work, is that there is kind of a little knowledge about the tools. There is a quite extensive knowledge about who are the actors who engage in anti-slavery, anti-trafficking work, but what are exactly the tools? There is still some gaps there. And what we've also noticed is that since these tools are provided by civil society organization, this can actually be the opportunity to engage collaboration, share best practices, avoid duplication among other civil society that work in the same space, but also provide a point of connection between, for example, businesses and civil societies. Grievance mechanisms are an example. Workers might trust more a civil society organization rather than a business when it comes to report to potential abuses or potential mistreatment. On this basis, what are the tools? we've been mapping tools in different countries through what we call the menu of services. It's a jargon. It's really trying to map in each country where we operate what is that the civil society can offer. And through this menu of service, which we are making available through the convenings that we are organizing, we try to provide direct contacts with these service providers in order to engage in a process. So 2 points here: importance of tools, importance of involvement of civil society. The tools are there: grievance mechanism, hotline, helplines, campaigns, hashtag, social media intervention and campaigns, etc. But what is needed is really engage in a process. So the tool itself is not the end of the story. What we're really trying to promote and what we would like to stress to close these remarks is a process, and what also I think Aisha was saying before, social media is important, but engagement with communities, engagement with other actors is key in order to reach change, because the tool itself won't. So probably I haven't replied specifically what are the tools, because they really change from country to country and really change depending on what are the priorities. We've seen responsible recruitment tools being developed in Malaysia, India, and Thailand. We've seen also capacity building for workers in the supply chain, especially targeting manufacturing in supply chain to detect child work and informal work. So the tools are there, we're trying to map them. We're making this mapping available to our stakeholders. But again, tools are important, but processes more. Sorry, I've taken a little bit more of my time. Back to you, Harpreet.
Yeah, I think we do have 5 minutes, so that's fine. Thanks, Stefania. Hemanta, do you want to add on to my last questions, Stefania, particularly in terms of, because you do bring in a lot of experience of campaigning using different tools for advocacy. Any specific tools that you think we should be sort of looking at, particularly in the context of business and human rights discourse?
The issue is actually, so when you go to the streets, you can find how busy people are actually. They're trying to live in their life. You know, it's a very harsh time everybody is going through at this moment, because not only because of the traditional issues, we have to find our food and other basic needs at the same time. So we are the same people facing all this, the climate change and all these big issues. Now, we have certain laws and mechanisms available, including these kind of accountability mechanisms, grievance mechanisms, etc. But unless these people with the power, with the resources, unless they respect to these kind of legislations and the mechanisms, etc., it's very hard for people to bring the justice. So I think as much as you create these new laws, policies, I think the real enforcement is very much necessary. So it's not only a legal or mandatory requirement, but it's also ethical requirement as well. I think people need to understand about why we want to bring so many different mechanisms, tools, etc. At the same time, I cannot avoid the need of the tools, like many of the tools we have been discussed here, and also educating the youth. I think that's one of the most important thing discussed in this room in the last 2 days discussion, because the youth is, I mean, we have borrowed this environment from the future generations, but when we are dealing with the environment, we don't give any kind of regard to that situation. So the youth has a right to demand from the people who are decision makers at this moment. So I think we have to give the justice to the future generation. And we are talking about intergenerational equity. We are talking about the rights of nature and all these things. But we really need to have the proper enforcement. I think these tools can be very helpful, bringing time to time. But I think it has a broader issue about the good governance. How can we make sure that we are dealing with these issues by our own generation without passing it to the next generation.
Great, thanks. And thanks, Aisha, for sharing this report. I think there are also, maybe perhaps we should also sort of start thinking about how do we use these reports, because, in some way, the reports like Aisha just shared on the chat here, before Aisha, I just hand it over to you for your last 2 minutes. But, perhaps these are the kind of reports that also helps us in some way, creating that baselines. So if you have this report with 60 brands, 60 fashion brands, when you've evaluated and measured their human rights and climate impacts, perhaps this is your baseline. And that's where, you start using these reports also and sort of some of the issues that have been raised for advocacy. And because we now have a baseline, there's something to measure against. And I think it's important to have these kinds of reports as well, perhaps, so maybe more sharing of data. And these kinds of reports could perhaps also be useful. Aisha, with that, I'm going to pass it on to you. You would have 2 minutes and we would be slightly over time, but I think it's really been an engaging and enriching discussion. So over to you.
Thank you. And I'm just in awe of all the panelists, and I've been learning and taking notes, and so appreciate this conversation. I'd say on the question of education, we currently have partnerships with some 22 universities where we teach human rights and social justice as a lecture, credit course. And it's amazing to me how little is being taught in universities today, which is why we make a lot of our educational materials open source. And I think that really is an untapped opportunity in terms of getting youth who you can then mobilize and engage in the movement. To the gentleman in the audience who said, we need creativity and fun, I 100% agree. In some ways, we've put the burdens of so much on the next generation. And so we really try to make our movement accessible and inclusive and have fun. And I think that is really important in order to really sustain and grow any kind of movement. In terms of the question of what's needed, I think one of the things that we haven't talked about is really following the money. In many ways, civil society has been co-opted by business. A lot of civil society today is essentially, whether it's grievance mechanisms or reports or rating systems, are doing it on behalf of the customer being business rather than workers. And I think therein lies the problem, which is why reports like ours, the accountability report, we've talked to human rights experts, climate experts, but we as an NGO take no money from the corporate sector. And so we really do think that putting this kind of data open source in the public domain will hopefully get us to collaborate and have greater impact together. So those are some of the things I wanted to share, and I'll turn it back to you knowing that we're right at time.
Great. Thanks, Aisha, for those final concluding remarks. I would just add this comment from here. It's in a Q&A, but Swedwatch conducted training on business, human rights, and environment to the youth in Bangladesh, which we are also aware that was much appreciated. And I think the importance of educating these issues sort of also in your university is just so crucial, particularly and I think all of us have been talking about how this is not just about us. It's more about also our future generations. And if we raise them right, I think we can make this world a better place. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you everyone here in the room as well. I think I really learned a lot myself. I hope you've had the same experience. Thank you everyone for joining. Thanks, Stefania, Aisha, and Annie. Maybe you could invite you for a virtual tea, but hopefully we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.